Welcome to Didactic, CAPS Board Study Edition. I'm your host, Dr. O'Leary, a child and adolescent psychiatry fellow in the National Capital Region. This is a podcast I designed to help myself and other child and adolescent psychiatry fellows study for their boards. But anyone who's interested in human development and mental health will get a lot out of this. For a rundown on how this show is produced, please see episode 1. I say that because I use AI to assist me in the content creation, and episode 1 explains how I do that. But even though I'm using AI, all the content in this podcast should be considered to be my opinion, my responsibility, and no one else's. So if you find errors in the content or you have suggestions for improvement, don't tell Google Gemini, tell me. Go to Didactic.com, fill out a form there, and let me know what you think. I've just finished a series on child development and on different ways to conceptualize the milestones and the challenges humans face as they age. And then I explored some of the ideas on how they do things like establish relationships with each other, like attachments, and then more generally, some ideas about how we learn. Today, I'm going to move into something more concrete. I'm going to start going through the various disorders that the DSM has that are relevant to child psychiatry. So we're going to start with the neurodevelopmental disorders. I'm going to go through each of these with an intent on defining what it is and also how to distinguish it from some other similar disorder, because that can often be a challenge. So to make this challenge a bit more real, I'm going to start with a case vignette. A 7-year-old boy, Tommy, is brought to your clinic by his parents, who are concerned about his development. They report that Tommy has always been a bit behind his peers. He was late to meet some developmental milestones, such as speaking and toilet training. In school, he struggles to keep up with classmates. He always has struggled to keep up with classmates. And he has difficulty with reading and writing, and often just seems kind of lost or confused during his lessons. He has a lot of trouble following multi-step instructions that his classmates can easily complete, and he often fails completing tasks independently. Socially, he struggles to make friends and to keep friends. He often misinterprets social cues and prefers to play alone. He also displays some repetitive behaviors, like hand flapping, when he's excited, and he has a strong preference for his stuffed rabbit. Which of the following is the most likely diagnosis for Tommy? Is it autism spectrum disorder without intellectual impairment? Is it attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, inattentive type? Is it a specific learning disorder with impairment in reading and written expression? Is it an intellectual disability, mild? Or is it social pragmatic communication disorder? Any one of those is supported by some of the data. But which one is supported by most of the data? Is he autistic? Does he have ADHD? Is it a specific learning disorder? Does he have a general intellectual disability that appears to be mild? Or does he have a social pragmatic communication disorder? The most correct answer here is that Tommy has an intellectual disability, and it's rated as mild. So while he shows some features of other neurodevelopmental disorders, the overall picture points toward intellectual disability, and here's why. He has global developmental delays. So he has a history of delays across multiple domains, in speech, in toilet training, academic learning, and in social skills. So this is the hallmark of intellectual disability, where difficulties are pervasive rather than just in a specific area. So we could rule out a specific learning disorder. He also has impaired adaptive functioning, so he struggles with age-appropriate tasks. He struggles with following instructions. He struggles with social interactions. So he has deficits in adaptive functioning across conceptual, social, and practical domains. His difficulties, while present, allow him to actually participate in school and to learn new skills. He just needs some support. He just needs a little more time. So this suggests a mild level of impairment. And we're going to get into later the difference between what mild, moderate, and severe might look like. But let's start with saying why the other options are a lot less likely. Why is he not autistic? Tommy has some features of autism spectrum disorder. He has a few repetitive behaviors, some social difficulties. His overall developmental delays and challenges with his adaptive skills are really the central picture here. But we haven't actually ruled out autism spectrum disorder. We just haven't made it the most likely thing yet. So he might also have autism spectrum disorder with a mild intellectual disability. But that's not what the vignette supports mostly. Next, does he have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder? Attention could contribute to his difficulties. He might not be able to really attend to things long enough, and so this could result in some of his delays. And there's really no evidence of hyperactivity or impulsivity as the primary concern. So we haven't 100% ruled out ADHD, but because it's kind of so pervasive and in multiple domains, and because of his deficits in adaptive functioning, intellectual disability is still a little more likely. I already talked about specific learning disorder, and so I'm not going to go over that again. But why not social pragmatic communication disorder? Well, that's where social communication is impaired specifically, and his difficulties extend way beyond that. So that's kind of like a specific learning disorder. It's like a specific autistic spectrum trait where it's not everything, just the social part. So how do we diagnose an intellectual disability? I'm going to start with the DSM criteria and then move on to something a little more practical. The first criteria includes deficits in intellectual functions. So this is difficulties in reasoning, problem solving, planning, abstract thinking, judgment, academics, and basically just learning from experience. And these deficits have to be confirmed by both the clinical assessment. So you have to, as a professional, look at the child and say, I think they have an intellectual disability. And their history is consistent with that. But you can't stop there. You have to do individualized, standardized intelligence testing. So IQ testing is absolutely necessary if you're going to diagnose an intellectual disability. Now, a score of 70 or below is considered significantly lower than the average of 100. But this is not a super rigid cutoff. I mean, you can have an IQ score that's pretty low, but not have all the adaptive functioning problems. So it's not the thing. Just because the score is, say, 68 doesn't mean that you can diagnose intellectual disability. You also need deficits in adaptive functioning. So this is how well a person meets the standards of personal independence, social responsibility, and that's at the expectation for their age and also for their cultural group. So what are they expected to be able to do that everyone else in their cohort can do? The deficits result in failure to meet standards in one or more areas of daily life, and these are conceptual, social, and practical. Conceptual areas are how you use language, read, writing, math, reasoning, knowledge, and memory. So how can you conceptualize your world in a way that's realistic and useful? The next is in social. Can you demonstrate empathy? Do you have good social judgment, interpersonal communication skills? Can you make and retain friendships when you're young? That's like the basic sign. Can this person interact socially well? The next is very practical. So can you take care of yourself? Can you do your own hygiene? Can you do your chores? If you were older, we would say, could you manage money or, organize work tasks? But here, the practical implications would be more like, can you get through something in school in an organized way without always needing support? So after we've established that there are deficits in intellectual functions, including IQ testing, and that there are deficits in adaptive functioning, we also have to establish that the onset of the intellectual and adaptive deficits was during the developmental period. It has to have been identified during childhood or adolescence. Sometimes you don't identify these things till later because people are not presented with problems that they have to solve. Like they might have been somewhat, you could say, isolated. And that might not be an intellectual disability when they first come into a more interactive way with society. They might just not know what to do. The difference between someone who has an intellectual disability and someone who's just kind of behind by inexperience is the inexperienced person without an intellectual disability will catch up pretty quick. The person with an intellectual disability will hit a wall, and they will have a hard time going past that wall. Now let's get on to some important notes about the severity levels. Intellectual disabilities specified as either mild, moderate, severe, or profound. And this is based on the adaptive functioning, not on the IQ scores. The IQ scores can be very misleading. This is based on their adaptive functioning. So it reflects the impact of their disability on their independence and their need for support. So it's very prognostic. And there's no single test that can determine intellectual disability. So IQ is definitely required, but it's not the only thing. You have to look at basically like a social IQ picture, how they act in different situations, whether or not they're adaptive in some and not all. If they appear to be really adaptive in some situations but not others, this is probably not intellectual disability. This is probably some sort of specific learning disability, or maybe even ADHD, because in ADHD, kids who have specific interests can become really good at those things, and the other things they're not so interested in, they struggle with. So that would kind of rule out intellectual disability because it's not pervasive. There are also a lot of cultural considerations. So does the culture expect certain things to happen by this time? They come to your office. Have you worked with the parents and talked to maybe some collateral about, like, well, what is going on in their life? And is everyone else kind of similar? Are they having to learn new languages? All sorts of questions. Another question is, do they have sensory impairments? Of course, you have to rule out things like, well, they're not doing well because they can't see well. They can't hear well. So we got to get rid of any barrier that they have to learn and see if they can learn. Really often, people with intellectual disabilities require some sort of support across their lifespan. If it's mild, they require little support like extra time to learn things, or maybe someone to just kind of check in on them sometimes. But if it's more severe, then they need a lot more support. Let me go through the severity levels just to end the podcast. When someone has a mild intellectual disability, they can learn practical skills. They just need a little extra time. They need some extra support to learn it. And they can usually maintain that learning. They can function with some assistance, but often independently. Maybe not entirely independently, but mostly independently. And they can achieve academic skills up to around the 6th grade, maybe a little bit higher, maybe into middle school. But middle school is where you really have to start learning how to be an adult, even though you're bad at it. So 6th grade's kind of a good cutoff to think of when you're thinking of what kinds of skills does this person have. Moderate intellectual disability means that they develop some communication and basic academic skills in childhood. They can learn some personal skills, perform some unskilled or like semi-skilled work with a supervisor, and they have some difficulties with like social conventions and stuff, but they require some level of support throughout their entire life in a lot of their domains. You can't just let them go on their own. They will not be successful. Someone with a mild disability might be successful in a lot of ways. Someone with a moderate disability just needs support, needs someone to be there to help them. If it's severe, They can't communicate well at all. They may not understand speech very well either. Now, they can learn simple routines like self-care tasks, but this requires significant teaching and support. Stuff like ABA, the applied behavioral therapies that you get when you have autism, would help someone with a severe intellectual disability to a certain degree learn those daily routines, learn how to do some basic self-care. But they're going to require supervision in basically all the settings that they're in, and they're going to require assistance with most of the practical tasks that they have to do in life. They are usually in a supported setting, like they live with their family their whole lives, or they live in a group home with other caregivers. The last severity level is profound. So a profoundly intellectually disabled person has very limited understanding of language and limited ability to communicate. They require assistance in almost everything, including personal care. They also often have significant motor and sensory impairments as well. Profound intellectual disability usually comes with a suite of lots of other things. There's something really wrong here, and we have to support this person 24 hours for the rest of their life. But every person is unique, right? Even with a severity level, there is a wide range of abilities and different tasks and a wide range of different needs. So we can't think of these as describing a person very specifically. They're accurate, but they're very imprecise. And the severity can change over time. Someone who appeared to be moderately disabled over time might actually make it into the mild category if there's a lot of interventions and they're able to learn, and during development something happens that allows them to change because they learn a lot of adaptive behaviors. So it's important to focus on strengths, like identify and build on what that individual can do, promote that, get them as much help as they can as early as possible, and that gives them the best chance of being as independent as they can possibly be. Thank you for hanging out with me today. I appreciate you being here. I'm going to be moving on to other neurodevelopmental disorders after this. But in the meantime, take care of yourself. I am Dr. O'Leary, and this has been an episode of Psydactic CAPS Edition. Nothing in this podcast should be considered personal, medical, or mental health advice.